One of the first signs an avoidant is preparing to replace their partner is something most people completely misunderstand. They think distance suddenly appears out of nowhere. They think the avoidant woke up one morning and stopped caring. But psychologically, that is rarely how it works. What actually happens is much slower, much quieter, and far more complex. The avoidant begins emotionally detaching long before they physically leave. And if you do not understand this process, you will keep searching for answers in the wrong places. You have to understand that avoidants are deeply uncomfortable with prolonged emotional vulnerability. At first, they can appear intensely connected, passionate, even emotionally invested. But intimacy creates pressure for them over time. The closer the relationship becomes, the more emotionally exposed they feel. And instead of communicating that fear directly, many avoidants cope by slowly reducing emotional access to themselves. It begins subtly. The conversations become shorter. Their emotional reactions become flatter. Affection starts feeling procedural instead of genuine. You notice they are physically present but psychologically somewhere else. And what confuses their partner is that nothing dramatic has technically happened yet. There has been no official breakup, no huge betrayal, no clear explanation. Just an increasing emotional absence that slowly changes the atmosphere of the relationship. This is where many people make a devastating mistake. They chase harder. The more distance the avoidant creates, the more reassurance their partner seeks. And ironically, that pursuit often accelerates the avoidant's withdrawal because now the relationship feels emotionally heavier to them. What they interpret is not love but pressure, not connection but emotional demand. So they detach even further. Now here is the deeper psychological truth most people never realize. Avoidants often detach emotionally before they detach physically because it allows them to reduce guilt. If they can emotionally disconnect first, they can convince themselves the relationship is already over internally before they ever have to face the external consequences. It becomes a form of emotional anesthesia. They numb themselves in advance. And during this stage, something dangerous starts happening inside their mind. Once emotional detachment begins, they become increasingly receptive to the idea of replacement. Not necessarily because another person is better, not necessarily because the relationship was hopeless, but because emotionally disconnected people become vulnerable to fantasy. The mind starts imagining escape instead of repair. That is why avoidants sometimes appear strangely calm near the end of a relationship while their partner feels panic. The avoidant has often been psychologically rehearsing the separation for weeks or months. Internally, they have already started transitioning away from emotional dependence. Their partner is reacting to the breakup in real time, while the avoidant has been emotionally preparing in silence. And this is important. Emotional detachment does not always mean the avoidant no longer cares. Sometimes they care deeply. Sometimes they are terrified of how much they care. But avoidant psychology is built around self-protection. When emotional intimacy begins triggering fear, obligation, vulnerability, or loss of control, distancing feels safer than confronting the emotions honestly. This is why you must learn to observe energy instead of words. Avoidants are often inconsistent verbally. They may still say, "I love you." They may still maintain routines, but energy never lies. Presence never lies. You can feel when someone is emotionally investing in the connection versus emotionally exiting it. And the tragedy is that many people spend months trying to recover the old version of the avoidant without realizing the emotional withdrawal itself is the message. Not every relationship can be saved by effort alone, because connection requires mutual emotional participation. One person cannot sustain intimacy while the other is silently disconnecting from it. When someone begins emotionally leaving before physically leaving, the relationship enters dangerous territory, because the body may still be present, but the soul of the connection is already fading. And once a person starts building emotional distance internally, replacement becomes psychologically easier than repair. Another sign the avoidant may be preparing to replace their partner is a sudden intensification of independence and secrecy. Now, independence by itself is not unhealthy. In fact, emotionally mature people should absolutely maintain individuality inside a relationship. But this is different. This is not healthy autonomy. This is emotional separation disguised as self-sufficiency. At first, the change can seem almost harmless. They stop sharing details about their day. They become vague about where they are emotionally. Plans that once included you suddenly become individual decisions. You notice they no longer naturally involve you in their future thinking. And when you ask simple questions, their responses feel guarded, defensive, or strangely private. It is as if an invisible wall has appeared where openness used to exist. What makes this dynamic confusing is that avoidants often justify it with language that sounds reasonable. I just need space. I need to focus on myself. I don't want to feel controlled. And sometimes those statements are genuine. But when secrecy starts increasing alongside emotional withdrawal, you are no longer looking at healthy independence. You are watching psychological disengagement in real time. You have to understand the deeper mechanism underneath this behavior. Avoidants are highly sensitive to anything that feels emotionally consuming. The more emotionally close a relationship becomes, the more they fear losing control of themselves. So when they begin mentally preparing to replace a partner or emotionally exit the relationship, they often attempt to reclaim psychological distance first. And one of the fastest ways to create distance is through secrecy. Secrecy gives them emotional ownership over a private internal world where the relationship no longer has full access. It allows them to compartmentalize. They can maintain the appearance of connection externally while internally separating themselves emotionally. This is why many partners describe the experience as feeling like the avoidant became emotionally unreachable long before anything officially ended. Now listen carefully because this is important. Secrecy is not always about another person. People often jump immediately to cheating. But psychologically, the issue runs deeper than that. The real shift is that the avoidant starts emotionally investing more energy into protecting their independence than nurturing the connection. And that changes everything. When someone is emotionally invested in a relationship, openness feels natural. They want to share experiences, thoughts, emotions, and future plans because connection itself feels safe and rewarding. But when someone begins preparing for emotional escape, transparency starts feeling threatening. Why? Because openness creates accountability. Intimacy creates attachment. And attachment creates emotional responsibility. So the avoidance slowly reduces access. They protect their phone more. They spend more time alone. They become harder to emotionally read. Their routines grow more separate from the relationship itself. And what makes this painful for their partner is that intuition notices the shift long before logic can explain it. You feel disconnected, but you cannot always prove why. This is where many people begin abandoning themselves emotionally. They overanalyze every interaction. They become hypervigilant. They start working harder for scraps of reassurance that once came naturally. And the tragedy is that the more anxious pursuit enters the relationship, the more trapped the avoidant feels psychologically. So they retreat further into independence. Now, does this mean every avoidant who wants space is planning to replace their partner? No. Mature space creates clarity and reconnection. Emotional distancing creates ambiguity and disconnection. There is a difference. Healthy independence still leaves room for emotional accessibility. Unhealthy detachment slowly removes it. And philosophically, this reveals something profound about human relationships. Intimacy cannot survive where self-protection becomes more important than truth. The moment someone prioritizes emotional escape over emotional honesty, the relationship begins losing its foundation. Because real connection requires vulnerability. It requires openness. It requires the courage to let another human being truly see you. Avoidants often fear that level of exposure because somewhere deep inside, dependence feels dangerous to them. So instead of risking vulnerability, they retreat into control. But control comes at a cost. The more someone hides behind secrecy and hyper-independence, the less emotionally alive the relationship becomes. And eventually, what remains is not partnership, but coexistence without intimacy. And the moment someone starts protecting distance more than connection, they are already halfway gone emotionally. Another major sign an avoidant may be preparing to replace their partner is the sudden rise of comparison. And this is where relationships often begin dying psychologically before they end physically. Because once someone starts mentally comparing their partner to imagined alternatives, the emotional foundation of the relationship starts quietly eroding from underneath. Now, comparison does not always appear in obvious ways. Sometimes it is direct. The avoidant suddenly talks about how someone else is easier, less emotional, more independent, or less demanding. But more often, the comparison is subtle. You feel it through growing criticism, through impatience, through the strange sense that nothing you do feels fully appreciated anymore. Things they once accepted about you suddenly become unbearable. Your emotions feel too much. Your needs feel too exhausting. Your desire for connection feels clingy. And what makes this painful is that the avoidant often rewrites the emotional reality of the relationship in their mind to justify their withdrawal. Instead of confronting their fear of intimacy directly, they unconsciously shift responsibility onto the relationship itself. Psychologically, this is an extremely important defense mechanism. Human beings struggle to hold guilt and emotional escape at the same time. So when someone is emotionally checking out, the mind often searches for evidence to validate the detachment. The avoidant begins magnifying flaws, focusing on imperfections, and imagining that fulfillment exists somewhere else, with someone simpler or emotionally safer. But here's the truth most people never realize. The comparison itself is often fantasy-driven, not reality-driven. Because avoidants are not usually comparing the current relationship to another real relationship with equal emotional depth. They are comparing a real relationship with responsibilities, vulnerability, conflict, emotional needs, and intimacy to an imagined alternative that exists without emotional pressure. And fantasy will always feel easier than reality because fantasy has no accountability. That is why emotionally unavailable people often idealize new connections in the early stages. Distance creates illusion. The unknown feels exciting because it has not yet activated their deeper fears. There are no expectations yet, no vulnerability yet, no emotional obligations yet. The fantasy partner represents freedom from discomfort, not necessarily genuine compatibility. And this is where many partners become trapped in self-destruction. They internalize the avoidance comparisons as proof they are inadequate. They start reshaping themselves to compete for emotional approval. They silence their needs. They overperform emotionally. They become obsessed with fixing every flaw in hopes of restoring the old connection. But you must understand something profound. When someone is emotionally detaching, no amount of perfection can repair a problem rooted in avoidance itself. Because the issue is rarely just you. The avoidance comparison process is often a psychological escape route away from emotional responsibility. Instead of saying, I am struggling with intimacy, they unconsciously say, maybe this relationship is the problem. Instead of confronting their fear of closeness, they convince themselves another person would feel easier. And in the beginning, it probably would. Every new connection feels light before attachment deepens. Every new relationship feels effortless before vulnerability becomes necessary. But eventually, intimacy always asks the same question. Can you remain emotionally present once real closeness begins? That is the real challenge avoidants struggle with. And philosophically, this reveals one of the deepest truths about human nature. People often search for new environments to escape internal patterns they have never healed. They mistake emotional novelty for emotional transformation. But wherever unresolved fear exists internally, it eventually recreates itself externally. So when an avoidant begins constantly comparing their partner to others, what they are often chasing is not a better relationship, but emotional relief. And relief is temporary, because no person can permanently satisfy someone who fears the very intimacy they secretly crave. The tragedy is that comparison slowly poisons gratitude. It blinds people to the value of what they already have. And once someone becomes emotionally invested in imagined alternatives, they stop fully nurturing the connection standing right in front of them. And the moment fantasy becomes more emotionally exciting than repair, replacement has already begun psychologically. One of the clearest signs an avoidant is preparing to replace their partner is this: they stop repairing conflict. And this is far more serious than most people realize, because relationships are not destroyed by conflict itself. Every deep relationship experiences tension, misunderstanding, disappointment, and emotional friction. What determines the survival of the relationship is whether two people are still willing to return to each other afterward. Healthy love is not the absence of problems. It is the presence of repair. When two emotionally invested people experience conflict, there is still movement toward reconnection. There is effort, curiosity, emotional responsiveness. Even when hurt exists, there is still a desire to restore closeness, because the relationship matters more than the ego in that moment. But when an avoidant begins emotionally preparing to leave or replace their partner, something shifts dramatically. They stop repairing, arguments become colder, shorter, more emotionally detached. Conversations that once ended with reassurance now end with silence. Instead of resolving tension, they withdraw from it completely. And what makes this dynamic so painful is that the partner often feels the emotional abandonment immediately, but cannot fully understand why it suddenly feels impossible to reconnect. This happens because repair requires vulnerability. To repair conflict, you must emotionally re-enter the relationship. You must acknowledge impact, tolerate discomfort, and allow emotional closeness to return after tension. But for avoidance, especially when emotional exhaustion or fear is built up internally, repair begins to feel overwhelming. Instead of experiencing conflict as a temporary problem to solve together, they experience it as proof that the relationship itself is emotionally draining. And once that perception takes hold, withdrawal starts feeling safer than reconnection. Now here is the deeper psychological layer most people miss. When avoidants stop repairing, they are often trying to protect themselves from emotional intensity. They convince themselves that detachment reduces pain, that silence creates safety, that distance restores control. But in reality, avoidance does not eliminate emotional damage. It silently compounds it. Because unresolved conflict never truly disappears. It accumulates underneath the relationship like pressure beneath the surface. Every ignored conversation, every unspoken resentment, every emotional withdrawal slowly weakens trust and intimacy. And eventually, the relationship no longer feels emotionally secure because one person has stopped participating in the process of emotional recovery. This is the stage where many partners begin emotionally overfunctioning. They become the only one trying to reconnect, the only one initiating conversations, the only one attempting emotional repair. And over time, this creates emotional exhaustion because connection can never survive through one-sided effort alone. You cannot build intimacy with someone who refuses to emotionally return to the relationship. And this is where the possibility of replacement quietly grows. Because psychologically, once someone stops investing energy into repairing the current relationship, they often begin directing emotional energy elsewhere, into fantasy, distraction, work, external validation, or even another person. Why? Because new connections temporarily feel easier than unresolved emotional depth. A new person has not yet witnessed their emotional patterns. A new connection has not yet accumulated conflict. A new interaction feels light because it has not yet required true vulnerability. But this is where avoidants often confuse emotional relief with emotional compatibility. The absence of conflict in the beginning does not mean a deeper connection exists. It simply means emotional depth has not yet been tested. Real love is not measured by how two people connect during ease. It is measured by whether they can reconnect after difficulty. And philosophically, this reveals something powerful about human relationships. Intimacy is not sustained by attraction alone. It is sustained by emotional courage. The courage to repair. The courage to stay emotionally present when discomfort appears. The courage to move toward connection instead of retreating into self-protection. Avoidants often crave deep love, but when fear overrides vulnerability, they unconsciously sabotage the very connection they desire. Not because they are evil, not because they do not care, but because emotional closeness activates unresolved fears they never learned to navigate safely. So when someone stops repairing conflict, do not ignore it, because silence is never neutral in relationships. Emotional withdrawal always communicates something. And the moment someone no longer fights to reconnect, the relationship is no longer losing arguments. It is losing emotional investment itself. Another powerful sign an avoidant may be preparing to replace their partner is a sudden increase in the need for external validation. And this is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in modern relationships, because people often focus only on the surface behavior instead of the emotional psychology underneath it. They notice the avoidant becoming more active online, posting more frequently, seeking attention indirectly, reconnecting with old romantic interests, flirting subtly with new people, becoming unusually concerned with admiration, appearance, or outside attention, and the partner immediately thinks they must be searching for someone else. But the deeper reality is more psychological than most people realize. Avoidants are often deeply conflicted human beings emotionally. They crave connection but fear dependence. They want intimacy but struggle with vulnerability. And because deep emotional closeness can make them feel trapped, exposed, or emotionally overwhelmed, they sometimes seek validation in places where intimacy remains shallow and controllable. External validation feels safer than genuine emotional closeness. Why? Because admiration from outsiders creates emotional stimulation without requiring true vulnerability. Attention feels rewarding without demanding accountability. Flirting feels exciting because it offers possibility without emotional obligation. And when an avoidant begins emotionally disconnecting from their partner, outside validation becomes even more psychologically attractive because it temporarily restores a sense of control, identity, and freedom. Now understand this clearly. External validation is not always about physical betrayal. Sometimes there is no affair at all. Sometimes the avoidant is simply redirecting emotional energy away from the relationship and toward environments where they feel less emotionally pressured. But emotionally, the impact can still be devastating, because relationships survive through emotional investment. Wherever attention consistently flows, emotional attachment slowly follows. And when someone begins feeding their emotional needs primarily through external admiration instead of relational intimacy, the connection at home inevitably weakens. This is why many partners describe feeling emotionally abandoned even before the relationship officially ends. They sense the avoidant's attention drifting outward. The emotional focus changes. Conversations lose depth. Presence decreases. Meanwhile, the avoidant suddenly seems energized by interactions outside the relationship while becoming emotionally flat inside it. Psychologically, this often happens because external validation temporarily protects the avoidant from confronting unresolved emotional discomfort within the relationship itself. Instead of addressing emotional distance directly, they unconsciously seek stimulation elsewhere to escape feelings of pressure, inadequacy, boredom, vulnerability, or emotional responsibility. And this is where the danger grows. Because validation can become addictive. The human brain is wired to respond to novelty and affirmation. Every compliment, every new interaction, every moment of attention creates a short emotional reward. And for someone struggling internally with intimacy, those temporary emotional highs can begin feeling more appealing than the slower, deeper work required to sustain a long-term relationship. But here is the illusion. Validation is not connection. Attention is not intimacy. Admiration is not love. Real intimacy requires emotional exposure. It requires consistency. It requires staying emotionally present even after the excitement fades. And avoidants often become trapped chasing emotional stimulation because stimulation feels easier than sustained vulnerability. This is why new attention can become psychologically dangerous during emotional detachment. The avoidant starts associating outside interactions with emotional freedom while associating the relationship with emotional weight. And once that mental association strengthens, replacement starts becoming emotionally conceivable. Not because the new person is necessarily better, but because the new interaction temporarily feels lighter. Now, philosophically, this reveals something deeply important about human nature. People often mistake what excites them temporarily for what can sustain them permanently. They chase emotional intensity while neglecting emotional depth. But intensity fades, novelty fades, external validation fades, and eventually every relationship arrives at the same destination: emotional truth. Can two people remain emotionally connected once fantasy disappears? Can they still choose vulnerability after familiarity replaces excitement? Can they build something deeper than stimulation? That is where real love begins. And this is why external validation becomes such a dangerous sign in avoidant dynamics. Because the avoidant is not just seeking attention, they are often escaping emotional presence. They are trying to feel emotionally alive without risking the vulnerability true intimacy demands. But no amount of outside admiration can heal internal emotional avoidance. Because when someone constantly needs the world to validate them externally, it often means they have lost connection with themselves internally. And the moment outside attention becomes more emotionally fulfilling than the relationship itself, emotional replacement is already unfolding beneath the surface. Perhaps the most painful sign an avoidant is preparing to replace their partner is when the relationship stops feeling emotionally chosen and starts feeling emotionally tolerated. And this shift is subtle at first. There is no dramatic announcement, no explosive ending, just a slow erosion of emotional presence that changes the entire atmosphere of the connection. You begin to feel it in the energy. The affection feels routine instead of genuine. Conversations become transactional. Time together feels more like obligation than desire. They still show up physically, but emotionally they feel absent, distracted, unreachable. And what makes this experience so psychologically confusing is that, on the surface, the relationship may still technically exist. The routines are still there. The messages still happen. The structure remains intact. But the emotional life inside the relationship begins quietly disappearing. This is one of the clearest indicators of emotional disengagement because love cannot survive on maintenance alone. Relationships need emotional presence. They need curiosity. They need voluntary investment. And when someone starts treating connection like a duty instead of a conscious choice, emotional decay begins accelerating beneath the surface. Now, psychologically, this happens because avoidants often detach internally long before they make external decisions. They reduce emotional investment gradually as a way to protect themselves from guilt, vulnerability, and emotional overwhelm. And over time, the relationship stops feeling emotionally alive to them because they are no longer fully participating in it emotionally. But here's what is important to understand. This emotional numbness is not always the absence of feeling. Sometimes it is emotional suppression. Avoidants frequently disconnect from their emotions because emotions themselves feel destabilizing. The deeper the attachment becomes, the more vulnerable they feel to disappointment, dependence, rejection, or loss of control. So instead of fully experiencing those emotions consciously, they create distance internally. They operate on autopilot. They go through the motions. They maintain the relationship structurally while emotionally exiting it privately. And this creates one of the most painful dynamics imaginable for the partner involved. Because human beings can tolerate conflict more easily than indifference. Anger at least still contains emotional energy. But indifference creates emotional uncertainty. It leaves the other person constantly questioning themselves. Did I do something wrong? Why do they feel so distant? Why does it feel like I'm no longer truly seen? And in response, many people begin overextending themselves emotionally. They try harder, give more, become more accommodating. They sacrifice their own emotional needs in hopes of reigniting the connection. But the tragedy is that emotional disconnection rooted in avoidance cannot be repaired through self-abandonment. Because intimacy is not sustained by one person working harder. It is sustained by two people remaining emotionally available to each other. And once a relationship becomes driven by obligation rather than emotional choice, resentment quietly starts growing underneath the surface. The avoidant feels emotionally trapped. The partner feels emotionally neglected. And both people slowly lose the sense of vitality that once made the relationship meaningful. This is also the stage where replacement becomes psychologically easier for the avoidant. Why? Because once emotional presence disappears from the current relationship, the mind naturally becomes more vulnerable to emotional alternatives. A new person represents possibility, stimulation, escape from emotional heaviness. The avoidant starts associating the relationship with pressure and outside possibilities with freedom. But this is where many avoidants misunderstand themselves. The problem is not always the relationship itself. Sometimes the deeper problem is that sustained intimacy eventually requires emotional openness they never learned to feel safe inside of. So instead of confronting the discomfort directly, they unconsciously detach from the relationship emotionally and search for relief elsewhere. Yet relief is not transformation.